Hey guys, tonight we're opening something that probably should have stayed sealed, a love letter. Specifically, a love letter from about 800 years ago. It's not on scented pink paper or typed in Helvetica. It's handwritten in ink that might have come from crushed oak galls, smeared on calfskin parchment, folded, sealed with wax, kissed with a moist prayer, and handed to a barefoot boy who had to dodge pigs, bandits, and occasional bubonic rats just to deliver it. You're going to read things like, "My liver burns with longing," and "Your eyes pierce me like the sword of Saint Michael," and honestly, you might not survive this. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me where you're listening from and what time it is right now. I love imagining the tiny medieval village your bed has become. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge through the mossy stone corridors of a monastery, the kind where every candle casts a trembling shadow and every footstep echoes like it's tattling. In a cramped scriptorium, a scribe is hunched over a slanted table. His quill scratches softly, dabbing into an ink pot that smells like wet bark and regret. This isn't some grand theological treatise. It's a love letter. Sort of. Medieval love letters didn't begin with "dear." They launched straight into existential crises. "I am unworthy to behold your beauty," one might begin, or "My soul rots in longing," which feels more like a Yelp review for purgatory than a romantic opener. You can imagine the poor recipient, probably a teenage girl, cloistered behind iron grills in a convent, reading those damp, overwrought words under a flickering rushlight, while a nun nearby tries to drown out temptation by chanting psalms out of tune. And yet, somehow, this was how people wooed each other. In the absence of dating apps, perfume ads, and edible underwear, what remained was imagination. That and a staggering lack of restraint when it came to metaphors. Medieval lovers borrowed heavily from scripture, astrology, medicine, and dreams. If a man dreamed of a woman's braid, that braid might suddenly symbolize eternal salvation. If she sent back a token, like a ribbon or a rosemary sprig, it could send him into a month-long poetic spiral, ending with something like, "My entrails are unspooled with desire." You think I'm kidding. Historians still argue whether these letters were truly romantic or just highly stylized exercises in courtly performance. After all, a nobleman might write the same exaggerated letter to 6 women in 6 cities and see who wrote back first. There are surviving examples of almost identical love phrases being reused like medieval copy-paste. Now picture this. The parchment is curled from humidity, the ink has bled like bad eyeliner, and a thumbprint, probably the sender's, still slick from roasted duck, has smeared one of the O's into something like a teardrop. You don't read a medieval love letter so much as decode it. They didn't have envelopes, so the parchment was often folded into tiny squares and sealed with blobs of wax, sometimes pressed with a ring, sometimes with a carved emblem like a rose, a heart, or in one unfortunate case, a snail. Snails, for the record, symbolize slowness, patience, and sometimes lechery. So there's that. A fringe fact for you? In some particularly earnest cases, lovers added a wet kiss by spitting slightly on the folded letter before sealing it. Why? Because saliva was considered a symbol of intimate breath and life force. Sort of like saying, here's part of me literally. Some even believed the kiss would spiritually protect the message. In reality, it mostly attracted insects. Fast forward a few centuries, and scholars in archives are unfolding these time-stiffened love notes with tweezers and latex gloves, peering at what looks like a coffee stain but turns out to be, oh joy, dried 14th century lip grease. You're not imagining it. These letters are literally gross and somehow still touching, because behind the mold and mildew and exaggerated phrases, there's something unmistakable, yearning, the kind of quiet, pulsing desperation that makes a person spend hours composing a metaphor about eyeballs as stars and kidneys as loyalty. It's oddly sincere, even when it's accidentally hilarious. There's one letter from the early 1300s where a merchant's daughter tells her suitor, "You must not worry about my cold hands, for my heart is boiling like lentils." Not exactly Shakespeare, but memorable. Another woman told her monk lover that she had hidden his name in her shoe, which sounds romantic until you remember how muddy medieval roads were. And what's even weirder, these letters weren't always private. If you were a noblewoman, your maid might read it aloud to you. If you were a scribe, your fellow scribes probably edited it for flair. If you were a monk writing to your secret flame, well, then you really had to hope Brother Gregory wasn't reading over your shoulder. Still, people risked it. They sent letters across mountains, through war zones, over borders. They copied them by hand when they got ruined by rain. They wrapped them in cloth or tucked them into shoes or, in one case, baked one inside a pie crust. Yes, that's real. It didn't work. Rats ate the crust. So tonight, as we start this story, remember, love makes people do ridiculous things. It made them smuggle folded parchments inside jars of goat cheese. It made them compare each other to root vegetables. And it made them whisper into the grain of parchment, hoping that across days and leagues someone would read those dripping metaphors and feel something. You stand in a stone courtyard beneath a sky that smells like rain and chimney soot. A young page boy, probably 12 years old and missing a few front teeth, tugs at the hood of his tunic and squints at the sealed letter in his hand. It's smeared already, some wax is flaked off, and he hasn't even made it out of the castle gates. Delivering a love letter in the Middle Ages was not a quick task. There were no mailboxes, no stamps, no romantic playlist humming in the background. If you wanted to tell someone you adored them, you had to physically get the words from point A to point B, which often meant sending it with a friend, a servant, or someone who owed you a favor involving chickens. You trail this boy as he starts his trek, letter tucked beneath his cap. The roads are thick with spring mud. The goats are not cooperative. At one point, he nearly drops the note into a puddle thick enough to drown a spoon. Medieval love letters had a moisture problem. Parchment made from animal skin did not love humidity. Wax seals could melt in the sun or snap in the cold, and ink, which was usually a mix of oak galls, iron salts, and wine or vinegar, tended to run if exposed to even a whisper of dampness. So it's not surprising that many surviving letters from this era are stained, blurred, or partially rotted. Love, it turns out, was often illegible. To make matters worse, letters didn't travel alone. Sometimes they were tucked inside leather pouches with dried meat, beads, or coins. And guess what those things did? They leaked. They attracted mice. They sometimes squashed the letters flat into little greasy ghosts. Wax seals were supposed to help. They acted like primitive tamper-proof stickers. But wax in the Middle Ages wasn't just beeswax. It was sometimes mixed with resin or even lead powder to make it more durable, or so they hoped. In humid weather, it became sticky. In dry cold, it shattered. You didn't just hope the message would survive, you prayed. One very damp example, a 14th century letter discovered in a Flemish convent, written by a widowed nobleman to a nun he claimed to have known in a past life. It was sealed 3 times, once with red wax, once with black, and once, quite bafflingly, with bread dough. Maybe he ran out of wax. Maybe he panicked. Either way, the seal grew mold. The letter stuck to itself. And today, the first 2 lines are illegible. All we know is that he opened with "My blessed" and ended somewhere around "sweeter than plums in Lent." Make of that what you will. Historians still argue whether people knew how fragile these letters were or whether they simply didn't care. Some believe the fragility added to the romance, the sense that the words themselves had to fight to arrive. Others think it was just bad planning. And then there were the seal tokens, little fabric or paper tags that bore the sender's mark. These were meant to prove the letter's origin if the main seal broke. Unfortunately, they also fell off easily, which meant some letters arrived anonymously. Imagine receiving a soggy square of folded animal hide that opens with "My soul is your prisoner," and having no clue who sent it. Romantic? Terrifying? Depends on the decade. Here's a quirky tidbit. During the 100 Years' War, some soldiers soaked their love letters in rosewater, then pressed them under warm stones to infuse the scent. The theory was that the fragrance would reach their beloved like a whisper across time. In reality, Rosewater stained the parchment a strange brownish hue. Combined with the sweat of a battlefield courier, the final result reportedly smelled like compost. But again, it's the thought that counts. And let's not forget the messengers themselves. Letters passed through hands that were rarely washed. A letter could arrive stained with grease from a half-eaten turnip, or worse, lice eggs hiding in the folds. That's not metaphorical. Lice were such a problem that certain abbeys required incoming letters to be aired by fire, a process that often crisped the corners or warped the ink. You pause under an awning with the page boy, who's swatting at a buzzing fly while trying to retuck the letter under his belt. It started to drizzle. His shoes are soaked. He has another day's journey ahead, and somewhere a girl is waiting for words she may never receive. But that's the other thing. People wrote these letters knowing full well they might not arrive. That love could be interrupted by mudslides, war, a bad sneeze, or simple forgetfulness. There's a beautiful kind of desperation in that, a belief that even if your words became nothing but smudged ink and misshapen folds, the act of writing them mattered. In fact, some letters weren't even meant to be delivered. Some were kept like charms, tucked inside pillows or prayer books. A woman in 13th century England reportedly wrote the same love poem 6 times, gave one to her maid, burned one at a shrine, and buried the rest under various trees, so the words might grow into blossoms. No record survives of the boy's response. So tonight, as you rest, imagine this: a folded letter, damp with rain and hope, smuggled in a sleeve or tied to a belt. It's creased and blurry, but it's still here, still readable, still holding, against all odds, the memory of someone who once believed in love, enough to risk the weather. You sit beside a flickering hearth, and someone slides a crumpled piece of parchment into your lap. It smells faintly of onions and old boots. You unfold it slowly, the fibers stiff and noisy. The first line reads, "To my sweetest little turnip heart, welcome to the romantic vocabulary of medieval Europe, where your beloved might be compared to root vegetables, poultry, or damp woodland creatures, and somehow it was meant as a compliment." Love in the Middle Ages didn't sound like a sonnet from Shakespeare. More often, it sounded like a poorly translated grocery list crossed with a herbal remedy. Endearments were as earthy as the people who used them. In German-speaking regions, a common nickname was mein Rübchen, my little turnip. In Old French, someone might be called mon petit chou, or my little cabbage. These might sound like insults to us now, but in a world where food was precious, calling someone your cabbage was essentially calling them life-sustaining and comforting. If that's not romance, what is? The logic was simple. If you adored something, you compared your beloved to it. So if your prized possession was a fine goose, your lady might be your golden-feathered gander. One 14th century French poet referred to his lover as my well-stuffed quail of delight. He was not joking, nor was the young scribe who, in a surviving Italian letter, wrote, "Your voice is like that of a milk goat calling at dawn," which, sure, historians still argue whether these food-based pet names were inside jokes between couples or standard tokens of affection that everyone used. Some letters suggest genuine humor. Others, like one from a young monk calling his secret lover "my little wild mushroom," seem completely serious. Medieval lovers didn't just borrow from the kitchen, they reached for animals too. A beloved could be a sweet lamb, a gentle dove, or a squinting ferret. Yes, that one happened. Dogs, interestingly, were a complex metaphor. Sometimes they symbolized loyalty. Other times they were used in a weirdly possessive way, like "you are the hound I feed with my sorrow." A real quote from a very dramatic night. And then there was the flora. Roses, of course, bloomed everywhere. Rose of my soul, blossom of mercy, thorn of my evening pain. But other plants crept in. Ivy meant clinginess. Mint symbolized clarity. Lettuce, for some strange reason, was associated with lust. A 13th century herbal love note reads, "When I see you, my lettuce wilts in joy." That's not even innuendo. It's just biology and confusion. But by far the strangest metaphors came from medicine. In a time when bodily fluids were thought to govern emotion, thanks humoral theory, people used anatomical references as tokens of love. You weren't just someone's heart. You could be their spleen, their liver, even their bile. One suitor wrote, "When you are gone, my gall turns bitter, and I cannot digest bread." Romantic and gastrointestinal. A quirky tidbit: the kidneys were once believed to be the seat of romantic longing. That's why certain love poems referred to a beloved as "my right kidney," implying they were vital, irreplaceable, and slightly squishy. There's even a preserved English letter from the 1400s where a woman writes, "I keep your name stored in my kidney, as in the Ark of the Covenant." It's unclear if that was charming or deeply unsettling, even back then. Now, not everyone had the gift of florid language. Some just copied from others. Sample love letters circulated in medieval conduct manuals. These pre-written phrases, called ars dictamines, included dramatic openers like "I am pierced by the arrow of your gaze," or "my sleep has become as tasteless as unseasoned broth." Kinda like pickup lines, but with more theology. Some of these phrases were recycled so often that scribes developed shorthand symbols for them, little pictograms that meant eternal devotion or "my soul follows thee." Unfortunately, modern historians have to guess what some of them mean, since the pictograms sometimes look like confused ducks. And here's where things get complicated. Sometimes people combined all of these: vegetables, animals, anatomy, religious metaphors, and food. Like this gem from a 12th century troubadour, You are my lamb, my lentil, my little lungwort blossom. Without you, I am but a collapsed lung. It's absurd, yes, but it was also heartfelt. Still, even in all this weirdness, there's something raw and real, because love wasn't abstract. It was physical, tangible. They saw their beloved not as some glowing ideal, but as someone who got rained on, had fleas, and probably ate garlic with breakfast. These metaphors weren't filtered through centuries of romantic comedy. They came from chickens and cabbage and gut feelings, literally. So tonight, as you listen to these strange little fragments of affection, remember that weirdness is timeless. Calling someone my stewed plum or my clammy joy might sound ridiculous now, but 700 years ago it was sincere, even poetic, kind of. And who knows? Maybe the next time someone calls you my emotional support onion, you'll know it's love. You're huddled in the back of a medieval scriptorium again, this time trying not to breathe too deeply. The air is sharp and metallic. In front of you, a monk stirs a foul-smelling concoction in a shallow bowl. It bubbles slightly, like soup made from regret and rust. He dips a quill into it, and the ink trails down with the consistency of spit mixed with soot. This is the stuff love letters were made of, literally. Medieval ink wasn't clean, wasn't fragrant, and definitely wasn't waterproof. In fact, it was one of the most temperamental ingredients in a love letter's survival. Most of the ink used in love letters, really in any writing at all, was iron gall ink. It was made by crushing oak galls, which are weird growths caused by wasps laying eggs in tree branches, soaking them in water or wine, mixing the result with iron salts, often from rusty nails or old cooking pans, and then adding something like gum arabic or vinegar to make it stick. The result? A gorgeous dark brown or near black ink that adhered beautifully to parchment until it didn't. If exposed to moisture, it bled. If left in sunlight, it faded. And if the recipe was even slightly off, it corroded the writing surface itself. Some letters in archives today are ghost-written in the truest sense. Only faint impressions remain where the ink literally ate through the page. Historians still argue whether these side effects were known at the time or whether scribes simply accepted them as part of the divine mystery of writing. After all, nothing was permanent, not even ink. Then there were the homemade inks, love letters written by amateurs, merchants, farmhands, apprentices, often used improvised recipes, soot and egg yolk, berry juice and vinegar, soot scraped from chimney bricks mixed with stale ale. And these smelled exactly how you think they did. There are records of ink described as sour as a widow's tongue, hot like sheep piss, and black yet full of flies. Want a quirky tidbit? One 13th century apothecary recommended using snail slime to thicken love letter ink because it holds fast and does not run as true love should. He also said It gave the ink a natural sheen. Probably not wrong, but snail-based ink didn't catch on. Because these letters were handwritten, the quality of the ink directly affected the tone. Some love notes show careful dark strokes, deep commitment perhaps. Others fade halfway through, like the sender lost interest or had to dash off to avoid being caught. One faded English letter reads, "My darling, my heart, you are the," and then disintegrates into a cloudy smear. Whether the ink ran or the author chickened out, we'll never know. Sometimes ink betrayed people. A monk in York was found out after the wax seal on his letter cracked, and the ink beneath had bled through the parchment, revealing a hidden line that read, "Meet me in the orchard. Bring no one but your silence." That orchard rendezvous never happened. He was reassigned to kitchen duty for a year. Let's talk color. Love letters were almost always written in black or brown ink. Blue and red pigments existed, but they were expensive and hard to stabilize. Still, there are a few wild examples of romantic letters in crimson ink. One Sicilian courtier reportedly sent a love poem written entirely in his own blood, claiming it was inked from the chambers of my heart. Scholars today agree it probably wasn't actual blood, just an over-the-top metaphor, or maybe rust-colored gall ink. But even the idea was dramatic enough to earn the letter a nickname, the Scarlet Oath. Here's another fringe example. In northern France, a noblewoman had a servant write her love letter in onion skin ink, made by soaking red onion peels overnight. It gave the writing a faintly purplish tinge. She believed it would make her words appear sweet and weeping at once. Her intended never responded. Maybe the onion metaphor hit a little too close. For those who couldn't afford ink or parchment, love was sometimes carved into bark. Birch bark letters survive from medieval Russia, scratched by sharp sticks. No ink required, just pressure, persistence, and a good tree. These wetless letters avoided the whole ink problem, but they weren't exactly easy to fold or seal. Hard to stuff birch into a tunic pocket, and in a few desperate instances, lovers scratched notes into candle wax or etched words onto dried leaves. These haven't lasted the centuries, but the imagination behind them has. Because every time a medieval person sat down to write, dipping a quill into sour ink, hoping the words would dry before smearing, praying the parchment wouldn't shrivel, they were doing something both mundane and ridiculous. They were trying to hold on to emotion through chemistry, through unstable fluids on decaying surfaces. And sometimes it worked. Against rain, against time, against mildew and ink corrosion and wax failure. So tonight, as you imagine the sleepy hiss of a fire and the soft scratching of a quill in the dark, think of the letters that still exist, blurry, fragrant with vinegar and wasp nests, full of spelling errors and heart-sick metaphors, and yet somehow still legible. Ink fades. But longing leaves a deeper stain. You're crouched beside a dusty wooden chest, fingering something stiff and soft all at once. It crackles when you touch it. No, it's not parchment. It's older, smellier, and stranger. This love letter, pressed between linens and locked away for centuries, was written on animal skin, not metaphorically, literally, calf, sheep, or goat. Welcome to the world of parchment, the medieval medium of romance, bureaucracy, and everything in between. Paper existed in the Middle Ages, sure, but it wasn't widespread until much later. In Europe, before the 14th century, paper was considered second-rate, something you used when nothing better was available. True lovers, desperate lovers, poetic lovers, they wrote on vellum. That's a fancy name for stretched, scraped, and smoothed calfskin. And if you were slightly less wealthy or in a hurry, you might use sheepskin instead. Cheaper, fuzzier, and sometimes still carrying faint traces of wool. That's right. You might receive a love note with a bit of fluff clinging to the corner. A literal "I love you." Historians still argue whether lovers intentionally chose finer skins to impress or simply used what was available. There's evidence that parchment quality often reflected social rank. A baron's love letter might be written on pale, near-translucent vellum, smooth as butter. A baker's apprentice probably inked his feelings onto something rougher, yellower, and more cracked than a winter heel. And here's a quirky tidbit for you. Parchment was often reused, scraped clean with a pumice stone and written over again. This was called a palimpsest. You could be reading a love poem only to realize faintly beneath it lies the remains of a sermon, or a shopping list, or a will. It's like romance was fighting to overwrite mortality, one layer at a time. Some scribes even worked with split parchment, a thinner version made by separating the skin layers. It made for a more delicate sheet, sure, but was prone to curling when wet, which of course happened often. Remember, these weren't sealed in plastic. They were folded, tucked, and smuggled under armpits or inside hollowed-out loaves of bread. Yes, really. One preserved recipe book includes directions for a loaf with message baked within for travel or confession. Essentially, you'd write your note, wrap it in cloth, stuff it into a hollowed bun, and bake. Love, now gluten encased. Unfortunately, rats and servants often got to these letters first. One recorded incident from Avignon mentions a nun who mistook a bread letter for a treat and ate the confession of a baker's lust. That probably wasn't the absolution he was hoping for. Even without culinary interference, parchment had a mind of its own. Humidity made it warp, dryness made it brittle, and if you folded it too often, the creases wore holes. Many surviving love letters today are partial at best, beginning with "To my golden sun flame" and ending abruptly with a jagged tear. And yet, people wrote anyway. Parchment, for all its drawbacks, was intimate. It wasn't mass-produced. Someone had to prepare it, stretch it, scrape it, smooth it by hand. There's something almost romantic about knowing that the surface of your love letter took days to craft, made from living skin, shaped by tools, polished with chalk. A message not just on something, but within it. There's also the peculiar fact that no two sheets were alike. Each bore faint patterns, veins, scars, discoloration. You could trace the shape of a spine. Some people even wrote their words around the imperfections, treating scars as frames. One surviving letter includes this line: "Your name I place upon the scar, that it may heal with my longing." A bit melodramatic, but points for creativity. Even the smell of parchment mattered. Vellum retained a faint musk, especially when warmed by the body. A hidden letter tucked inside a shirt or sleeve for days would take on the scent of the sender. It wasn't perfume, it was sweat, leather, and skin, intimate, maybe too intimate. Here's a fringe example for you. A knight imprisoned in Flanders wrote 12 tiny love notes on bits of old parchment and tied each one to a feather plucked from his own cloak. He called them his flutterings. Only one survives. The others were lost to wind or geese. And then there were parchment tokens, letters that doubled as keepsakes, folded into elaborate shapes: a heart, a rose, a bird. Some included perforations for ribbons or were dyed with crushed petals to add color. A few even had holes where lovers had pricked the surface with a needle in secret symbols, Morse code before Morse existed. So tonight, as you lie back and imagine the soft rustle of centuries-old skin unfolding in the dark, think of all the messages written with cramped fingers and hope, inked onto something once alive, folded, hidden, passed hand to hand, carried in sleeves, tied to dogs, sealed in bread. Because parchment didn't just hold words, it absorbed them. Every confession, every ridiculous nickname, every prayer whispered between the lines. It soaked up longing the way skin soaks sun. And it still holds that warmth 700 years later. You find yourself trudging behind a hunched figure on a rutted country road. His tunic is patched, his sandals squelch with mud, and on his back hangs a bulging satchel, its flap secured with a bone toggle. Inside, a few scraps of folded parchment and a very squished plum. You're following a medieval letter carrier, and today he's got a love note tucked in among tax receipts, ecclesiastical summons, and what appears to be a laundry list for a bishop. Delivering a love letter wasn't a job. It was a risk, because in the Middle Ages there was no organized postal service, just a messy patchwork of hired messengers, obliging pilgrims, bribed monks, or anyone traveling in the right direction and too polite to say no. Some letters were sent with trusted friends. Others were handed off to servants with strict instructions. Do not read it. Do not lose it. Do not, under any circumstances, let my father see it. Naturally, it was often read, sometimes lost, and frequently intercepted by fathers. Historians still argue whether these informal courier systems were efficient or wildly chaotic. Letters sometimes arrived in days, sometimes weeks later, sometimes never. A romance could bloom or wither in the space between dispatch and delivery. And then there's the hygiene situation. A medieval messenger wasn't galloping across pristine meadows with wind-blown hair like in movies. He was trudging through damp forests, muddy lanes, and flea-ridden inns. His cloak was rarely washed, his hands were rarely washed, and the contents of his satchel, let's just say parchment, wasn't the only thing riding in there. One recovered bag from a 14th century monastery included love letters, dried anchovies, a tangle of rosary beads, and a dead lizard. The cause of death? Unknown. A quirky tidbit: in parts of Italy, particularly during festivals, lovers used to sneak letters into the robes of traveling friars, not because the friars delivered them, because the letters were meant to be found later by someone else. It was like medieval Tinder. Swipe through robes, hope for poetry. If you were trying to be discreet, you'd employ creative methods. Some lovers stitched folded letters into the hems of garments. Others hid them inside hollowed-out bread loaves, yes, again, or bound them into the covers of prayer books. One German merchant is recorded as delivering a letter rolled tightly into a chicken bone, sealed with beeswax. That chicken was roasted and served before the message was ever found. And when letters were delivered, the drama didn't end there. Recipients didn't just open them and read them like a modern text. They sometimes staged it, unfolding the parchment slowly, inhaling the scent, however questionable, and, if they were wealthy, having it read aloud by a maid or tutor. That's right. Your very personal message of longing might be announced in a formal tone over breakfast, while someone sliced cheese and picked their teeth. One noblewoman's surviving diary mentions that her maid mispronounced 3 words and paused too long before the phrase, "my glistening urge," ruining the entire mood. Can't blame her. Secrecy was critical. Letters were folded in complex patterns to prevent tampering. Some were tied with thread, others sealed with wax or cloth knots. If you wanted extra security, you might add a tiny charm to the string, a pressed flower, a bead, or, in one bizarre case, a dried frog toe. Don't ask. No one knows. And if you were really afraid of interception, you might write in code. Simple substitutions, scrambled Latin, or shared phrases only your lover would understand. One recovered letter ends with, "When the moon is fat, remember the hedgehog," possibly a rendezvous signal, possibly nonsense. But codes didn't always work. Spies, jealous rivals, or over-involved family members sometimes intercepted and deciphered messages. In one famous case, a bishop's niece was caught passing love notes to a knight. When her uncle found out, he read the letter aloud during dinner and then burned it in front of her. The knight, humiliated, joined a monastery. The niece married a merchant. Romance died, roasted like the chicken that probably once carried a letter, too. Let's not forget the problem of mistaken identity. There are several documented cases of messengers delivering letters to the wrong person. In a small town, that could be a catastrophe. One confused blacksmith in Brittany received a passionate poem meant for the apothecary's daughter. He read it aloud to his drinking buddies, assumed it was a joke, and responded with crude limericks. The original sender was not amused. And here's a fringe detail. Some professional letter carriers, yes, they existed in certain cities, wore medallions or wooden badges showing they were trusted by the word. These messengers swore oaths not to read the letters they carried. But temptation being what it is, some would hold the parchment up to candlelight, trying to decipher phrases like, "My darling lentil heart," through the folds. Tonight, picture that. A mud-splattered messenger, too tired to question anything, slipping a folded note through a crack in a cottage door. The note lands on the floor. The hearth glows. A shadowy figure kneels, unfolds it, and reads aloud, perhaps, to the fire. Because love in medieval times didn't just demand bold words, it demanded carriers, risk, and the blind faith that somehow, some way, a message whispered onto parchment would reach another heart, across filth, suspicion, storms, and frogs. You press your back to a crumbling castle wall, the stone cool and damp with the memory of centuries. In your hand is a folded letter, sealed, slightly smudged, and trembling with urgency. Above you, on a wooden balcony, a woman peers down. She holds her breath. The wind smells of wet hay, candle wax, and fire smoke. Somewhere beyond the hills, a war is starting. But right now, in this exact moment, all that matters is what's written on that slip of skin-thin parchment. Love in the Middle Ages was never just sweet. It was also sickly, doomed, and often written from places you'd rather not be. Battlefields, plague houses, siege towers, confessionals. These weren't love letters from a place of ease. These were declarations carved out of chaos. In many cases, lovers were separated not by geography, but by crisis. Letters became the only connection. A woman might send a note to her betrothed trapped behind city walls during a siege, writing, "Though arrows fall upon our roof, I send this with my breath." A knight might scrawl a feverish line from a plague infirmary. "If you do not reply, I shall know you are taken by the Black Death or by marriage, either of which is my ruin." Historians still argue whether most of these dramatic phrases were sincere or theatrical, part of the courtly love tradition where suffering was proof of devotion. But many examples suggest people genuinely believed love should endure suffering. Some even insisted on it. Pain was part of the package. You weren't truly in love unless you were also starving, bleeding, or being excommunicated. During the Hundred Years' War, there's evidence of letters tucked into armor, scraps with phrases like, "I go to death, thinking of thy hands." One soldier wrote home from a mud-drenched trench outside Calais, apologizing for not sending a token of love because, quote, "the rats took the ribbon." A quirky tidbit? In several Plague-era letters, people wrote, "I have not yet coughed this day," as an affectionate reassurance. There are even preserved notes from lovers who quarantine themselves in separate houses, passing messages through windows using hook sticks or baskets on ropes. Social distancing, 14th century edition. But love letters weren't just about bodily survival. They were spiritual too, especially among the devout. Some suitors vowed to pray for their beloved soul at every vigil. Others promised to fast, to chant entire psalms, or even to kiss relics in their lover's name. That's right. One Parisian scribe swore he would press his lips to the toe of St. Denise's statue every Wednesday until we meet again. Can't say chivalry is dead, and the metaphors grew even more intense during hardship. A man might describe his beloved as my bread in famine, my candle in pestilence, or my fortress against the devil's siege. It wasn't subtle, but it was heartfelt, especially when you were living with the constant risk of actual famine, pestilence, and sieges. There's a preserved letter from 1350 written by a merchant to his pregnant wife while the city was under lockdown due to plague. He writes, "If I do not return, name the child for what you have most loved. If it is cheese, so be it. That's real love, equal parts tragedy and humor." But even outside of catastrophe, love letters thrived on high drama. The popular genre of amorous epistles trained people to write as if every goodbye might be final. Sample phrases included, "If I do not see thee by Michaelmas, bury my heart with the sheep, and my soul has already boarded the ship to heaven, waiting only for your gaze to untie the sails." Of course, sometimes people exaggerated for effect. One young noblewoman famously faked a grave illness to lure her suitor home from campaign. She had a servant write in trembling Latin, "The lady has but one hourglass left of breath." The knight raced back across 3 counties only to find her sipping wine in the garden. She married someone else a month later. Love hurts. And when these letters failed, when they arrived too late, were misunderstood, or simply disintegrated in the rain, people wrote more. Love inspired repetition. One man in rural Wales is recorded as sending 12 notes in 12 days, each more melodramatic than the last. By letter 8, he had promised to blind himself with bramble thorns if she did not reply. Letter 12 arrived after she'd already accepted someone else's proposal. Tragic. Also, ouch. Let's not overlook the healing power of a reply. Many correspondences ended with promises of health, fertility, protection. "Your words restored my stomach," wrote one woman. "Since your last letter, my boils no longer grieve me." Romance and dermatology side by side. Here's a fringe fact. Some believe that receiving a letter during illness could literally transfer healing. A 15th century physician in Florence claimed that reading a letter soaked in rose water and written by a chaste hand could drive out melancholy. Naturally, this led to people faking chastity or spritzing random letters with scent to sell them. Etsy shops have nothing on medieval fraud. So tonight, picture it. A woman unrolling a damp parchment beside a flickering rushlight, her fingers trembling as she reads, "Though death dance in the street, I think only of your feet." She doesn't laugh. She closes her eyes and whispers his name into the candle, because medieval love letters weren't just soggy or sappy. They were stubborn. They were sent through sickness, across burning bridges, and under papal bans. And sometimes they made it, and sometimes they didn't. But either way, someone still sat down in the dark, dipped a quill, and began with the words, "I am yours, even as the world falls." You crouch in the shadows of a cloister garden, and before you on a stone bench lies a folded piece of parchment, sealed, stained, and unmistakably kissed. It's damp in the corners, warped along the edges, and pressed tightly shut with more than just wax. This one was sealed with a secret, because tonight you're reading a love letter that was deliberately made wet. Yes, wet. In the medieval world, a kiss wasn't just symbolic, it was practical. Letters weren't sealed merely with wax or string. Sometimes they were sealed with you, a pressed lip, a tear, a drop of blood, or brace yourself, a little spit. The practice sounds strange to modern ears, but sealing a letter with bodily moisture was common enough to be recorded in multiple traditions. A woman might breathe into a fold before closing it. A knight might dab the parchment with wine touched to his lips. A nun might anoint the corner with a tear, then pray the letter safely through sin and weather. Historians still argue whether these moist seals were meant to be spiritual, romantic, or superstitious. Some say they functioned like charms, protecting the message, binding it to the body. Others see it as a direct form of intimacy, a way to send a literal piece of yourself when physical touch wasn't allowed. A quirky tidbit? In some French convents, novices believed that breathing into a love letter could carry the sender's voice across distance. So they'd fold the letter quickly after whispering into it, trapping the breath like a spell. There's even a preserved example where the note reads, "Do not unfold this near water, for my sigh is sealed within." Let's talk about blood. Yes, it happened. Not every letter, not every lover, but there are surviving notes sealed with red-brown stains that, upon chemical testing, turned out to be the real deal. Drops from fingers, tongues, even thumbs pricked on holy days. One dramatic monk wrote, "I swear my vow in red, for ink is coward speech." Romantic? Maybe. A health risk? Absolutely. But more often, it was saliva. Spit wasn't seen as dirty in the same way we treat it now. It was considered a bodily essence, warm, vital, tied to the breath. A kiss involved moisture. So did devotion. So sealing a letter with spit wasn't just sealing it, it was investing it. The same way one might bless a relic or a cross. A particularly florid love letter from Bohemia declares, "My lips, my tongue, and my truth, all pressed into this page. Let no fire undo it." Not all moist letters stayed sealed. Sometimes they soaked right through the parchment, smudging the ink and warping the words. You'd think people would learn, but they didn't. In fact, some leaned into the mess. They added perfume or pressed flowers damp with dew. There's a surviving English note with a damp lavender head still faintly attached. The message? "I send you my scent, though I dare not send myself." Others got creative with moisture. One knight's letter included a ribbon that had been dipped in water from his baptismal font. Another was scented with waters from the spring where we first met. Probably charming, possibly riddled with bacteria. And some letters, perhaps the strangest, were sealed by mouth, folded carefully, pressed between lips, and sealed with a true kiss. There's an Italian example where the instructions say, "Do not touch this seal with hands, only with the lips that speak my name." Whether that's romantic or deeply inconvenient depends on your tolerance for parchment-flavored smooching. Of course, these practices raised problems. If you sealed a letter with something damp, it could stick permanently, or worse, start to smell. One scribe in Bavaria complained that a love note he received had gone sour and reeked of old cheese. He still kept it. Love makes fools of us all. There were consequences, too. Church authorities frowned on bodily tokens in correspondence. One bishop issued a stern letter condemning the pressing of mouths to parchment as indecent mimicry. He probably didn't get a lot of mail. Here's a fringe fact. In rare cases, especially among nobles, lovers would bind their letters with a lock of hair and a kiss. The hair was braided into thread and wrapped around the folded note. The kiss sealed it closed. It was called binding breath. Only 3 such examples survive today, all severely deteriorated, but you can still see the faint outline of lips on one. And when these tokens didn't arrive, it hurt. One jilted lover wrote, "You sent no ribbon, no lock, not even spit. My heart withers like a dry cloth." It's whiny, but relatable. So tonight, as you picture folded parchment, picture it alive, warm from a hand, damp from a mouth, bearing the actual residue of desire, not just ink, but flesh, not just metaphor, but matter. That's the medieval secret no one tells you. Their love wasn't just lyrical, it was physical. They believed that moisture, breath, sweat, a dab of tongue could carry emotion. That sealing a letter wasn't just sending words, it was sending a piece of your body across time and distance. And even now, centuries later, we unfold those pages. We see the smear, the curve, the stain, and we know someone loved so hard they left a trace. You're hunched over a cracked wooden desk, candle sputtering, and in your hand is a love letter so full of mixed languages it feels like three people wrote it at once. Domina mea carissima. It begins in Latin. Then, Je vous aime trop in French. And finally, Ich brenne für dich in early German. The grammar is questionable, the spelling even worse, but the message is unmistakable. This writer is in love, confused, and probably writing by moonlight after one too many goblets of something fermented. Welcome to the multilingual chaos of medieval love letters. Writing wasn't standardized back then, not even close. People spelled phonetically, or copied what they'd seen elsewhere, or just made it up as they went along. And when it came to love, clarity was optional. Flourish was everything. In one surviving letter from the 14th century, a suitor spells the word beautiful 6 different ways on the same page. Beauty, beauty, beaut, beauty, beauty, and beauty. It's a romantic mess, and yet somehow charming, like a toddler trying to recite poetry while chewing on the paper. Historians still argue whether this inconsistency was purely accidental or whether, in some circles, quirky spelling became a kind of fashion, especially among young nobles trying to sound sophisticated. One theory, that mixing languages, Latin for gravity, French for elegance, English for intimacy, allowed writers to show off while still sounding emotionally sincere. You can imagine the effect. A letter that began, Mon cœur soupire, and ended with, Wilt thou meet me at the hedge? A perfectly awkward, swooning fusion of courtliness and mud-stained reality. A quirky tidbit. Some people included intentional misspellings as a private joke with their lover. For instance, calling someone mincemeat of my heart might indicate an inside joke about a shared meal or a cheeky nod to passion that scrambled their brains. These quirks became tokens of recognition. You weren't just getting a letter, you were getting your letter. Then there were the poets, troubadours, clerics, minor nobles, anyone with a pen and too much time delighted in riddles, allusions, and wordplay. They invented hybrid languages or used rebus writing where pictures replaced words. A simple heart symbol could mean love or bleeding, or you forgot our anniversary and now I'm sad. One night sent a love poem entirely in Latin, bad Latin. It opened with, O femina dulcissima, tu es meus baconus of joy. That's not a typo. He combined classical Latin with the English word bacon to create his own culinary metaphor. Scholars aren't sure if he meant to be poetic or if he genuinely thought baconus was a word. Either way, she married him. Of course, language wasn't always a choice. In multicultural cities like medieval Toledo, where Jews, Muslims, and Christians mingled, people often had to write in mixed tongues. A single letter might contain Hebrew terms of endearment, Arabic poetic forms, and Latin scripture quotations, all layered over whatever regional dialect they actually spoke at home. These letters became strange, beautiful patchworks. One Judeo-Spanish note found in Cairo begins, Mi alma es tuya, my soul is yours, in Ladino, then slips into Arabic for a verse about jasmine-scented nights, before closing in Hebrew with Shalom ve'ahava, peace and love. It's a linguistic love knot, and nearly impossible to translate cleanly. But this tangle of languages also created tension. One Venetian merchant accused his daughter's suitor of blasphemy by confusion, because his letter mixed church Latin with vulgar street Italian. The resulting phrase, Domina, your eyes do stab me like a god's toenail, was perhaps not the persuasive device he'd hoped. And then there were the mistakes, truly catastrophic ones, like the baker's apprentice in York, who meant to write I adore you in French, but instead wrote Je dors sur vous, I sleep on you. Close, but not quite. Or the nun who tried to confess her secret feelings using Latin and accidentally referred to her beloved as my holy urinal, a mistranslation of scapha, meaning small boat, which she mistook for a term of affection. That particular letter, thankfully, was never delivered. Here's a fringe example for you. Some medieval scribes developed their own shorthand systems, a kind of love code made of squiggles and abbreviations. Think of it like emoji, but with more ink blots. One such system from 15th century Bruges includes a symbol that looks like a fish swallowing a key. We think it means, my secrets are yours. But it could also mean, don't eat the pickled herring. Scholars are still debating. Despite the chaos, it worked. The spelling didn't matter. The language could be mangled. What mattered was the effort, the intent, the simple, sloppy courage of trying to say something true with the tools you had, no matter how confusing those tools might be. Because when you're in love, you don't always reach for perfect grammar. You reach for anything, any phrase, any language, any scribble that might carry what's burning inside you. So tonight, as you drift into sleep, imagine a lover hunched over a candle, biting their lip, trying to remember how to spell beloved in Latin while rhyming it with woolen. They don't quite succeed, but the letter still arrives, smudged, chaotic, glorious, and you unfold it with a smile, because even if it says, I burn for your livers, you know exactly what they mean. You're hidden behind a thick curtain of ivy, eavesdropping. Don't worry, it's historically appropriate. Across the courtyard, two monks walk briskly, their robes flapping, one whispering urgently to the other. He's just discovered something, a letter, folded and perfumed, tucked inside a psalter, not addressed to the abbot, not to a bishop. No, this one is for Sister Clarice. Monks and nuns weren't supposed to fall in love. That didn't stop them. Some of the most haunting and frankly awkward love letters from the medieval world came from people who'd taken vows of celibacy, silence, and obedience. And yet, their hearts remained inconveniently human. Historians still argue whether these cloistered romances were rare exceptions or quietly widespread. On one hand, most monks and nuns took their vows seriously. On the other, people are people, and convents and monasteries were often the only places where literate men and women lived near one another. You can see how things might have evolved. There's a famous collection of 12th century letters exchanged between Héloïse and Peter Abelard, a philosopher and a nun, whose affair and subsequent heartbreak became legend. Their writing swings from philosophical debate to raw emotional yearning. One moment, Abelard is quoting St. Jerome. The next, he's reminiscing about that secret corner behind the cloister wall. These weren't metaphorical letters. They were soaked in real memory, and yes, occasionally a little self-pity. A quirky tidbit: some nuns developed elaborate ciphers to protect their messages. One system involved using musical notation, numes, to convey emotional tone. A rising note meant joy, a falling one, sorrow, an accidental, passion. Basically, medieval Morse code set to Gregorian chant, and some monasteries had entire secret channels for delivering messages. A novice might slip a note under a loaf of alms bread. A nun might pass her missive with the laundry, pinned into the folds. One abbess in France reportedly ran a covert matchmaking network between younger nuns and visiting scholars. Her nickname, La Mère Cupidon. The letters themselves are something else. One begins, "Your voice in prayer is a song I would sleep within." Another, from a monk to his former lover in the secular world, reads, "Though I have taken the robe, my soul still wears your name as underclothes." Uncomfortable imagery aside, it's oddly poetic. There's also the strange etiquette these letters followed. Monks often wrote in elevated Latin, drawing heavily from Scripture. A love letter might open with Benedictus qui venit in corde tuo. Blessed is he who comes into your heart, before pivoting into a surprisingly detailed memory of kissing under a fig tree. Nuns, especially educated ones, replied with sharp wit, quoting saints like Catherine or Hildegard to veil their feelings in layers of holy metaphor. One letter preserved in a convent archive ends with, "As the lilies of the field toil not, neither do they weep, but I do both." It's unclear if the prioress intercepted that one. If she did, she likely pretended not to understand. That was often the rule. Don't ask, don't translate. But there were scandals, of course. One German abbey excommunicated 2 monks after discovering a year-long exchange of flirtatious letters with nuns from the convent downriver. The letters were confiscated and copied by church officials, and honestly, they're pretty spicy for 1378. One line reads, "Your eyes turn my prayers to steam." Another, "When you kneel at matins, I kneel with you in thought, if not in flesh." Sometimes the danger was the appeal, the forbidden fruit of passion flavored with incense and candlelight. One friar wrote, "My vows bind me to God, but my dreams bind me to you, and I am torn like the veil of the temple, the drama, the theater, the theological metaphors, its emotional cosplay with eternal consequences." Still, not every letter was so polished. Many were clumsy, handwritten in haste, full of scribal errors and scratch-outs. One nun scrawled on the back of a recycled sermon sheet, "I think of your hand beside mine, though I hold only rosary." Another confessed to weeping on a letter before burning it, writing in the margins, "Ashes know my longing better than saints." That's an emo lyric waiting to happen. A fringe example? In a Scottish convent, a monk once sent a love letter in verse, addressed to "a rose behind stone." The catch? He also sent a potato carved into the shape of a heart. Unfortunately, the tuber rotted before delivery. The letter, however, survives and contains the unforgettable line, "Let no one dig but thee into my soft soul." Romantic, slightly unhinged? Yes, but these letters also show restraint. These were people trying to balance love and salvation, desire and duty, and that tension is everywhere. One letter reads, "I love you with the part of my soul that is not yet claimed by heaven." Another says, "Your name distracts me from prayer, and I have begun to like it." These aren't seductions, they're confessions. And when letters weren't answered or were answered coldly, it stung more deeply than a worldly rejection. A nun in York wrote, "I have prayed away your name, and now my dreams arrive silent." That's heartbreak in cassock form. So tonight, imagine someone writing by candlelight, robes rustling, fingers trembling. Imagine them tucking that note between the pages of a borrowed hymn book, knowing the risk, hoping it's received, dreading that it might be, because even behind the highest walls, behind vows and veils and holy promises, love still found a way to ink itself into margins, to press itself into folds, to speak softly beneath the chant. And centuries later, we still hear it. You're deep inside a medieval study where someone's just knocked over an ink pot. It pools on the parchment like spilled wine. Fitting, really, considering what the writer's about to say. This letter doesn't open with "darling" or "light of my life." It begins, "Your liver is my joy." Yes, liver. Welcome to the unexpectedly visceral world of medieval anatomy metaphors, where your beloved might be compared to lungs, kidneys, or intestinal lining, and it's all very heartfelt. We think of the heart as the universal symbol of love, But in the Middle Ages, people weren't so exclusive. They distributed emotion throughout the entire internal real estate. The liver was believed to be the seat of desire and vitality. The spleen governed melancholy. The kidneys, passion. So saying, "I love you with all my liver," wasn't gross. It was intense. Historians still argue whether these references were purely medical or part of a larger metaphorical language that people genuinely found beautiful. Either way, they weren't uncommon. Surviving letters include phrases like, "You are the balm to my gallbladder. Your laughter stirs my spleen," and the all-time classic, "My kidneys tremble in your absence." Let's be honest, this isn't a bouquet of roses. It's a meat diagram of emotion. It made sense, though. Medieval medicine, based on Galenic humoral theory, believed the body was governed by four fluids: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Emotional states were tied to these fluids, and they, in turn, were associated with organs. So love, especially longing, was considered a literal imbalance of the body. You weren't just heartbroken, you were medically lovesick. A quirky tidbit: physicians were sometimes asked to treat love sickness with herbal infusions targeting specific organs. Rosemary for memory, brain; thyme for breath, lungs; and fennel for kidneys. So if someone wrote, "I send you fennel for your fire," it was both a compliment and a prescription. And then there were the full-body metaphors. One Italian letter begins, "Your name moves through my limbs like wine," followed by a detailed account of how the sender feels each syllable travel from fingertips to toes. A little dramatic, but nobody in that era was aiming for subtle. Some writers even mapped their lovers onto their bodies. One soldier wrote, "Your voice lies in my ear, your sorrow in my stomach, your kindness in my joints." It's oddly tender, like emotional acupuncture. Others took a more poetic route. In one 13th century Welsh letter, a bard wrote, "I feel you in the pace of my blood. You are the throb in my thumb, the ache in my fasting belly, the stitch that stitches my chest to the sky." And you just know that somewhere someone read that and swooned, or cringed, or both. But even all this wasn't enough for some lovers. They illustrated their metaphors. Some surviving letters contain tiny anatomical doodles, hearts with wings, lungs that breathe out names, or livers pierced with arrows labeled longing. One enthusiastic French cleric sketched an entire circulatory system and wrote in the margin, "This is how you move in me." A literal take on love flowing through the veins. Still, the organ metaphors could be unsettling. A 14th century nobleman once addressed his lady as "my spleenful swan," which may have sounded poetic to him but sounds like a poultry illness now. Another called his beloved "a fever in my blood, a clot in my devotion," which raises both romantic and medical red flags. Then there's the matter of the tongue. not just as a symbol of speech, but of taste, of truth. Letters often read, "Your name rests sweetly on my tongue," or "Your absence dries my mouth." Combined with the earlier practice of sealing letters with saliva, the effect is, well, let's say the letters had flavor. And don't forget the spine. It symbolized loyalty and uprightness. Telling someone, "You are my spine," was not only a compliment, it meant they were your support, your structure, which is lovely if slightly anatomical. Here's a fringe fact. A 15th century French physician compiled a guide called De l'amour et du corps, or On Love and the Body, which advised romantics on the proper organ-based complement for each stage of courtship. Early interest? Mention the lungs. "Your breath makes me restless." Committed affection? The liver. "You live where my fire is kept." Long-term devotion? The bones. "Your presence strengthens my frame." Creepy? Maybe, but thorough. Some people rejected these metaphors entirely. A few surviving letters simply say, "My love is beyond anatomy. I feel you in my shadow," which is abstract and also a little ghosty, but maybe preferable to being called a gallbladder of joy. Still, it's hard not to be charmed by the effort. These writers weren't trying to gross each other out. They were using the language they knew, the language of flesh, humors, and healing, to describe what they felt. So tonight, imagine a lover by candlelight, nervously biting their lip, deciding whether to say heart or liver, or "You're the warmth in my spleen," and they go for it, because medieval love wasn't afraid to get a little internal. And honestly, maybe that's what love is, letting someone past your ribs, past your filters, into the sticky, messy center of your very self, and hoping they write back. You're standing in the corner of a smoky hall, the kind with antlers on the walls and rushes on the floor that haven't been changed in weeks. A knight, mud-splattered, half-drunk, and freshly returned from campaign, reaches into his satchel and pulls out a bundle. No sword, no coin. It's a lock of hair, wrapped carefully in a bit of silk. He presses it to his lips with the solemnity of a relic. He's not alone. In the world of medieval love letters, people didn't just send words, they sent pieces of themselves, literally. Let's start with the classic, hair. Locks of hair were probably the most common physical token sent alongside love letters. A braid, a single curl, or a tied bundle might be folded inside a letter or wrapped separately in cloth. Sometimes the hair was perfumed or dyed with herbs. Sometimes it still smelled of soap or of campfire smoke. Either way, it meant intimacy. You were being sent something the other person had grown, cut, and chosen to part with. In an age without photographs, it was the closest you got to holding their image. One preserved letter from a lady to her knight reads, "Take this lock pressed between psalms and keep it until your heart no longer speaks my name." That's both poetic and threatening, very on brand. But not all hair gifts were voluntary. A quirky tidbit: in some courtly traditions, knights claimed a token from their lady before departing. If she refused to give one, he might snip a lock while she wasn't looking. One rather dramatic case from Burgundy records a knight being slapped with a glove after he tried to cut a strand from a countess's veil during a feast. He still kept the glove. Love is nothing if not resourceful. Beyond hair, there were stranger tokens. Pieces of fabric were common, especially ribbons or sleeves. A knight might wear his lady's ribbon tied to his lance, or even sew it into his armor. One poem tells of a ribbon that blushed with her blushes and bled when he did. Probably not literally, but you never know. And then there's the truly odd: bones. Yes, bones. In a few fringe cases, lovers exchanged tiny animal bones, like bird knuckles or carved fish bones, engraved with runes or initials. Some were worn as charms. One superstitious suitor in Prague sent his beloved a sparrow skull to guard her virtue. She sent it back with a note that said, "Keep your dead bird. I have nuns for that." More spiritual types sent holy dirt, that is, soil from a sacred site, like a pilgrimage route or a shrine, sprinkled into a folded letter or sealed inside a linen pouch. One knight mailed a pinch of earth from Santiago de Compostela with the note, "As my feet walk there, let my soul walk to you." It's romantic, if a bit crunchy. One especially ambitious noblewoman sent her lover a thimble-sized relic box containing a thread from her shift, a dried petal from her garden, and a fingernail. No explanation, just the nail. He reportedly wore it in a pouch around his neck for years. That's either devotion or serial killer energy. Tokens also included food, sort of. Dried rose petals, sugared almonds, or slices of candied ginger sometimes traveled with letters, not for nutrition, but for symbolism, sweetness, endurance, preservation. One letter came with a stick of cinnamon and the line, "I cannot give you heat, so I send this instead." But these physical additions weren't always practical. Travel was slow. Letters got wet, torn, gnawed on. More than one love note has arrived missing its treasured lock, replaced instead by rodent teeth marks, and some tokens backfired. One man sent a love note wrapped in his bloodied campaign bandage as a token of sacrifice. His beloved fainted. Still, people took the risk. They believed these tokens carried meaning, emotional and magical. A letter with a curl of hair wasn't just a message, it was a tether, a stand-in, something to hold when the sender couldn't be held. And the return tokens, those were just as telling. One woman sent back her lover's ring with a string attached to a bit of parchment that read, "Unloop me from your heart," a brutal mic drop. Another returned a lock of his own hair, braided and burned at the end, with the phrase, "I loved you, but I've changed." Iconic. Some kept the tokens forever, buried with them, hidden in prayer books, stitched into linings of clothing near the heart. Archaeologists have found such objects, tiny knots of hair sewn into undergarments, or bits of cloth wrapped in waxed linen and sealed tight. Often there's no name, just a presence. Here's a fringe case. In the 15th century, a German knight was buried with dozens of love letters stuffed into the lining of his doublet. Most had small fragments, threads, dried herbs, stains that might have once been perfume. Only a few still bore legible text. One said, "You did not die when you left. You lived inside a fold of me." So tonight, imagine a letter, not just ink on parchment, but a thing that feels, a lock of hair still curled, a pressed flower, brittle but red, a frayed ribbon knotted 3 times. These weren't just symbols, they were relics, tactile memory, love with a shadow, because sometimes words weren't enough. You had to send a piece of yourself, soft, strange, crumbling with time, and hope that centuries later someone might still feel it. You kneel in the corner of a town hall, hiding behind a barrel of pickled herring, because something scandalous is about to unfold. It's market day in 15th century Norwich, and the usual gossip about cheese mold and sheep theft has been interrupted by a single soggy sheet of parchment. A love letter. And not just any love letter. This one leaked. Meet Marjorie. Marjorie was not noble. She wasn't cloistered or literary or married to a knight. She was the daughter of a fishmonger with questionable handwriting and a flair for dramatic punctuation. But Marjorie did one thing with overwhelming, catastrophic enthusiasm. She wrote a love letter, and it got wet. The letter, which still survives in fragments, was delivered on a summer morning in 1449, handed to a baker's apprentice by a friend of a friend who may or may not have been paid in pears. It was meant for a tailor's son, a young man known for his excellent calves and general disinterest in everything. Unfortunately, by the time it arrived, it had rained. He opened it outside, near the well. The ink had bled. The words had run together into tragic, looping rivers of emotion. The townspeople, never ones to waste a bit of drama, gathered around to read what they could. The fragments included, "My sweet, wet you are," believed to be, "Sweetheart, you are." "The moon is my onion." "Your arms are like," smudged into what appears to be wet rope. "Kiss me in the puddle." You can see how this didn't go well. Marjorie's name was recognized from the signature, half legible but unmistakable. The tailor's son, embarrassed or maybe just amused, shared it with a friend. That friend shared it with his sister, and within a day everyone from the shoemaker to the candle seller had read, mocked, or misquoted poor Marjorie's romantic ramblings. She was humiliated, but not defeated, because 2 days later Marjorie wrote another letter, this one wrapped tightly in waxed cloth and hand-delivered by a neighbor's goat-herding cousin. It began, "If my words bled like rain, they still reached you. Let the town laugh. Let the ink run, but know this, my feeling is dry as fire. That's not bad, honestly. Historians still argue whether Marjorie meant dry, as in reliable, or as in scorched, but either way, the letter landed, and this time it didn't leak. The tailor's son responded clumsily. His reply opened with, "To the most watery of hearts I send my driest smile." Not exactly sonnet material, but in the end they were seen together at the midsummer fair, sharing a honey cake. Love triumphs. A quirky tidbit? The original letter, the drippy Valentine, was copied by a local schoolmaster and used as an example of how not to fold your passions into weather. It became a minor cautionary tale for apprentices. Seal your corners, or your secrets become soup. But this wasn't a unique case. Dozens of recorded letter scandals across medieval Europe involved soggy sentiments. One Flemish merchant wrote to a widow he fancied, but folded his letter with fresh rose petals inside. The moisture stained the parchment, bled the ink, and turned "Your eyes are pools" into "Your pools bleed eyes." She was not impressed. Another case from Rouen. A note written in wine rather than ink, don't ask, turned purple and illegible during delivery. The recipient drank the letter in a dare. Romance. Cancelled. Yet these soggy disasters were part of the risk. Medieval love didn't travel well. It bled in the rain, warped in the heat, and withered in the cold. But people still tried. They folded their feelings into fragile corners and trusted them to errand boys, goats, and leaky bags. Even when letters weren't ruined by weather, they could be destroyed by laughter. A woman in Devon sent a heartfelt note to a miller's apprentice, only to discover he'd read it aloud at the tavern in a falsetto voice. The letter survived, barely, but her dignity did not. She never wrote him again. Good. And of course, some scandals were more serious. One baron's daughter wrote secret love letters to a stable boy. One of them was found in the hay, soaked with water and boot polish. When her father read it, he had the boy sent to the army. The girl was married off to a man who sold fish glue. She reportedly refused to write anything for the rest of her life, including her own name. Still, it wasn't all tragedy. Marjorie's letter is remembered not just because it got wet, but because she didn't give up. She wrote again, louder, clearer, wetter, maybe, but wiser. And here's a fringe fact for you. A guild of parchment makers in Norwich later started offering lover's sealant, a mixture of beeswax, lavender oil, and egg white meant to waterproof letters. It smelled awful, but it worked. So tonight, picture it, a crumpled love letter, the ink running like mascara, opened in a crowd. People laugh. Someone reads aloud the line, "Your lips drip like apples." But somewhere in the blur, someone feels it, the pulse behind the page, the realness, raw and awkward and human, because medieval love wasn't about perfect delivery. It was about daring to write something that might not survive the journey, but writing it anyway. You're tucked into a corner of a drafty chapel-turned-library, surrounded by scrolls and candles that have seen better centuries. You reach for one parchment, brittle at the edges, and unroll it gently, expecting maybe a psalm or a legal contract. But instead, you find a poem, rhymed, awkward, bold, and, if we're being honest, a little tragic. It begins. Thy face is like a morning fog that blinds mine eyes and feeds my dog. Ah, yes, we've arrived at the world of medieval love poetry, heartfelt, accidental, and often very, very bad. Not every love letter came in straightforward prose. Some aspiring romantics fancied themselves poets, armed with rhyming couplets, vague metaphors, and zero formal training. They scrawled verses onto parchment, tucked them into letters, or sang them beneath balconies with varying degrees of success and pitch accuracy. These poems were not always appreciated. Historians still argue whether these poetic flourishes were an expected form of courtship, or more like a bonus feature for those who thought they had the gift. Regardless, poetry crept into love letters like damp into castle walls, slowly, stubbornly, and impossible to ignore. Some of it was lovely. A 14th century poem from a baker's son to his betrothed reads, I see thee when the doe doth rise, and think thy smile more fair than pies. Wholesome, doughy, honest. Others, not so much. A nobleman once compared his beloved's teeth to the hooves of gleaming goats, which raises questions. Another described a woman's breath as soft as curdled milk. It's unclear if that was a compliment or a cry for help, a quirky tidbit. Some poems were borrowed from troubadours and passed off as original. This led to multiple cases of competing suitors sending the exact same verse to the same lady. One German widow reportedly received 2 sonnets titled My Moon Among Turnips, one signed by a baron, the other by a monk. She married a brewer instead. Let's talk about the mechanics. Medieval poetry didn't follow modern rules. Rhyme was king. Rhythm was optional. Spelling, as always, was fluid. A single poem might rhyme love with dove, then switch and rhyme heart with departed and cart, and then give up entirely. One infamous example comes from a Welsh farmhand who wrote, My heart it jumps, it skips, it flaps, when I do see thy muddy claps. Scholars still don't know what muddy claps means. Possibly a dance? Possibly not. Still, the effort was endearing. For many, writing in rhyme was a way to show effort, to elevate their message. Even if the results were clunky or confused, they meant something. You weren't just saying, I love you. You were attempting art, however questionably. Sometimes these poems were attached as scrolls or folded inserts. Others were integrated into the letter itself, poem on the front, prose apology on the back. One knight, clearly uncertain of his own talent, wrote, If this verse fails, ignore it and read below instead. My feelings, at least, are not misspelled. Then there were the playful ones. Some lovers exchanged riddle poems where the subject wasn't named directly. A woman might receive a rhymed letter beginning, I am not dog, nor fox, nor cat, but I do purr when thou art sat. If she guessed the sender, she'd write back. If not, he'd try again. This was either adorable or deeply unsettling, depending on tone and delivery. And, of course, there were the threats. Mild ones. Love me, or I shall rhyme forever was a surprisingly common refrain in rejected suitor poems. A French shepherd once vowed to compose one stanza every week until he died or was married. He stopped at 14. The sheep probably asked him to. Here's a fringe example. In a 15th century monastic school, a group of students passed a parchment between them, each adding a love line to a shared poem meant for the washerwoman's daughter. It included 13 verses and 4 wildly different writing styles. She kept the scroll, married none of them, and later opened a pastry shop. Win-win. Not all poetry was meant to impress. Some lovers mock themselves intentionally. One man described his feelings as limping like a goose with gout, while another compared himself to a beetle squashed with longing. These were self-deprecating verses, what modern ears might call romantic cringe-core. But they worked, because they were honest and funny. And when a poem did land, when the rhymes flowed, when the metaphors hit just right, it could become legend. Towns remembered them, scribes copied them, minstrels stole them and sang them at inns. One verse, originally penned in the margin of a love letter, later appeared carved into a church pew. When candles fade, I think of thee, the one who burns instead of me. That's good. That's haunting. So tonight, picture a young man kneeling at his bedside, squinting at parchment, muttering to himself, what rhymes with love, shove, glove, above? He's sweating. He's scratching out lines. He's trying to make longing rhyme with threshing floor. He knows it's bad, but he keeps going, because medieval love wasn't always graceful. It was messy, lopsided, full of weird animal metaphors and unintentional threats. But it was brave. It said, I know this might be embarrassing. I know I'm not a poet, but I'll try anyway. And that, even now, might be the purest form of love. You're tucked into the shadows of a candlelit throne room, watching the quiet rustle of silks and scribes as one letter, just one, is carried forward. Not a declaration of war, not a decree of land rights, but a love letter. And this one, it doesn't just cause a blush, it topples a crown, because sometimes a single romantic message could undo an entire kingdom. Tonight, we turn to one such letter, surviving only in fragments, but whispered about for generations. A royal affair, doomed from the first smudge of ink. The story begins with a queen, young, clever, married off in a treaty union to a man twice her age. the sort of political match made more from maps than moonlight. She lived in a castle with thick stone walls and courtiers who never blinked, but she also had a tutor, foreign, poetic, and perhaps a little too interested in courtly metaphors. Some say the queen wrote the letter, others claim it was the tutor writing under her name. What we do know, the letter was not meant for her husband. It contained no names, just riddles. Lines like, "You who taught my tongue to wander. My crown is heavy, but my dream wears none. Where the ink runs, I forget my name." Historians still argue whether these were confessions of love or cleverly disguised cries for help. But the letter was found, intercepted, the wax seal broken not by its intended, but by a royal cousin with a reputation for tattling. And then chaos. The king, humiliated, called a court council. The tutor was dismissed, sent to a monastery in the far north, where he reportedly wrote only scripture for the rest of his life. The queen was locked in a smaller chamber, her correspondence censored, her writing desk removed. The letter, copied, analyzed, and passed around court like scandalous dessert. It didn't stop there. Word of the letter that burned the crown traveled beyond borders. A rival kingdom used it as propaganda, claiming the queen had betrayed not just her husband, but the alliance itself. And when the marriage was eventually annulled, quietly, with official language about incompatibility and diplomatic interests, the rumors never faded. A quirky tidbit: one version of the story claims the letter was smuggled out by being written in lemon juice between the lines of a sermon. It could only be read by warming it over a flame. Another theory says it was inked in goat's milk and smelled faintly of lavender and scandal. The exact text is lost, but echoes of it appear in later poems, plays, and even prayers. One anonymous 15th century ballad includes the haunting line, "Her words did more than armies march." This wasn't the only time a love letter rewrote history. Take the case of Lady Eleanor of Kent, who sent a letter to her lover warning him to flee after overhearing her father plot his arrest. She hid the letter inside a hollow ring which she gave him during a feast. Unfortunately, he misunderstood, thinking it was a romantic gift, not a dire warning. He stayed. He was arrested. She was disowned. The ring survives. The letter, too, tiny, brittle, and smeared with what appears to be a tear. And then there's the scribe who wrote a love letter for someone else, a merchant's daughter, too shy to confess her feelings. The letter was meant for a goldsmith's apprentice, but the scribe fell in love with her while ghostwriting. He added a line at the end, "If your heart leans to another, he is closer than this page." They married. The apprentice never found out. Fringe fact: in certain courts, writing love letters without permission was a punishable offense. In 15th century Naples, an edict declared that no letter of affection shall pass between blooded houses without ecclesiastical review, which basically means the bishop had to approve your flirting. Sexy. But censorship rarely stopped anyone. Lovers grew sneakier. They used ciphered initials, coded flowers, hidden folds. One noblewoman developed a system where each corner fold meant something. One fold up is "I miss you." Two folds ill, "We are watched." Three ill, "Do not write again." Like origami espionage. And when discovered, these letters could ruin more than relationships. They disrupted inheritances, sparked duels, inspired imprisonments, and occasionally changed the course of dynasties. All because someone wrote, "My night is hollow without you," on the wrong piece of parchment. Yet people kept writing, even knowing the risk, because love, when denied, doesn't retreat, it innovates. So tonight, imagine a royal hand trembling slightly as it dips a quill into ink, aware that every word might echo into scandal. Imagine the scratch of pen on vellum, the soft puff of breath to dry the seal. Imagine the thrill, the danger, the wild, foolish hope that this time the letter will arrive safely and not unravel a throne. Because in the Middle Ages, even the softest love note could carry the weight of nations, and even the gentlest phrase could become the sharpest blade. You're standing in a chilly archive where sunlight filters through slatted windows and dust hangs in the air like ancient breath. A scholar carefully unfolds a letter so fragile it rustles like dry leaves. The ink is faint, the folds permanent, the corners nibbled by time. You peer closer. It's a love letter. It doesn't begin with passion or poetry, just "To the one who once looked at me." No name, no date, no grand metaphors, just a quiet voice echoing across centuries. And beneath it, nothing. The rest has faded, or was never written, or was written and washed away. This is what remains of medieval love, crumbs and ghosts. Most letters didn't survive. They were too fragile, soaked, burned, eaten, repurposed. A love note might have ended its life lining a pie tin or crumpled under a merchant's heel. Some were shredded into tinder, others used as stuffing for shoes. Some were hidden so well they were never found again. And yet some endured. Historians still argue over why certain love letters made it. Was it the ink quality, the sender's social status, a wax seal placed just right, or pure romantic luck? What we do know is that we have just enough to glimpse the depth of feeling from people we'll never meet. People who wrote things like, "I sleep curled around the thought of your breath," or "My ribs are a cage for your memory." Sometimes we don't even have the words, just imprints, ink shadows where the letter once kissed parchment, dried glue where a ribbon used to be, faint outlines where lips once pressed a final blessing. One quirky tidbit: some archivists have developed methods for reading these faded letters using spectral imaging. Entire stanzas have emerged under ultraviolet light, verses no one had read in centuries. One such line, hidden in a love note buried in a church wall, reads, "I die in 1,000 folds, waiting to be opened." Even now, medieval love letters haunt us, not just because they're beautiful or tragic, but because they're unfinished, half erased. Their incompleteness is what makes them so human. Some letters are never answered. Some are replied to too late. Some are rewritten again and again, each version more desperate, more restrained, more damp with tears or with mildew. And still they exist. On scraps of calf skin, on papery bark, inside shoes and songbooks, and the folds of forgotten tunics. A fringe example? In the ruins of a convent in Austria, archaeologists uncovered a wooden comb wrapped in waxed linen. Inside was a single phrase scratched with a pen. "He kissed my name into his cup." No one knows who wrote it. No one ever will. But someone did, and that someone felt something. Tonight, picture this: a folded letter left in a field. Rain falls, ink runs, the page discolors, worms crawl across it, a sheep tramples one corner, but still some words remain. My soul is yours. If I am silent, I am louder than before. Find me in the fold. Medieval lovers didn't expect permanence. They wrote in a world where most things vanished. Plagues came, borders shifted, parchment rotted. But they wrote anyway, because love, they believed, was worth recording, even if the record didn't last, even if no one answered, even if all that survived was one soft curl of hair in a rotting prayer book, or a dry drop of ink pressed into a heart that forgot how to beat. So tonight, as your eyes begin to close, imagine them, the scribes, the farmers, the nuns, the knights, the nervous teenagers with sweaty palms and crooked handwriting. They're bending over a table, or a stone, or their own knees in candlelight. They dip their quill, they pause, and they begin to write. Because even now, centuries later, they still hope someone is listening. And now, with the last letter folded, we rest. Let the imagery soften. The quills are dry. The candles sputter into silence. The pages, smudged, kissed, soaked, are placed gently back into their boxes of velvet and wood. You are no longer standing in the shadow of a monastery or crouched beside a muddy road. You are here, warm, eyes half closed, and safe. The sounds of scratching ink fade into the breeze. The scent of wax and rose water and old paper dissolves into sleep. The whisper of parchment against parchment, the slow hush of folding words becomes the rhythm of your breath. Forget the letters now. Forget the strange metaphors and the organ poetry. Forget the ribbons and the rain and the way words sometimes leaked through the cracks. All that remains is the feeling, quiet, ancient, persistent. You are not reading anymore, you are dreaming. And in that dream, a letter arrives. It is meant for you. No wax seal, no ribbon, just your name, gently spoken. You unfold it slowly. It says nothing and everything. It says, you are not forgotten. So drift now. Let the ink blur. Let the language dissolve. Let your breath follow the curve of soft, distant script. There are no more stories tonight, just the quiet knowledge that love, even messy, wet, medieval love, endures. Sleep well.